Rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp and official, bearing the seal of the Armed Forces Recruitment Command. Elena Vasquez had been expecting it for weeks, but when she finally held the envelope in her trembling hands, the weight of those words felt heavier than she had imagined. Thank you for your interest in serving your country in a combat capacity. However, after careful consideration of your application and assessment results, we regret to inform you that you do not meet the physical and psychological requirements for frontline infantry positions. Elena read the letter 3 times before setting it down on her kitchen table, next to the cold cup of coffee that had long since lost its steam. Outside her small apartment window, the city hummed with its usual morning rhythm, cars honking, people hurrying to work, children laughing on their way to school. Life continued as normal for everyone else, but for Elena, this moment marked the end of a dream she had carried since childhood. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of East Los Angeles, Elena had learned early that survival often meant being tougher, faster, and smarter than those around you. Her father, Miguel, had been a Marine who served 2 tours in Vietnam before returning home with haunted eyes and hands that shook when he thought no one was looking. He never spoke much about the war, but Elena had inherited his discipline, his unwavering sense of duty, and his belief that sometimes good people had to stand between evil and the innocent, no matter the cost. At 17, while her classmates were worried about prom dates and college applications, Elena was already planning her military career. She spent her afternoons at the local shooting range, where old-timer veterans would grudgingly admit that the quiet Latina girl had a gift that couldn't be taught. Her eye was steady, her breathing controlled, and her focus absolute. When she held a rifle, everything else in the world seemed to fade away except for the target and the gentle squeeze of the trigger. But natural talent meant nothing in the face of military bureaucracy and institutional bias. At 19, Elena stood 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed barely 115 pounds. The recruitment officers took one look at her slight frame and dismissed her dreams before she even had a chance to demonstrate her skills. They pointed to height requirements, weight standards, and physical fitness benchmarks that seemed designed more to exclude than to evaluate actual capability. Miss Vasquez, the gruff recruitment sergeant had said during her final interview, barely looking up from his paperwork, the infantry isn't a place for someone like you. Have you considered military intelligence, or perhaps a support role? There are plenty of ways to serve your country without carrying an 80-pound pack through hostile territory. Elena had wanted to argue, to demand a fair assessment, to show them what she could do with a rifle in her hands. Instead, she had nodded politely, thanked them for their time, and walked out of the recruitment office with her head held high and her heart breaking. That was 3 months ago, and the official rejection letter was merely a formality, the final nail in the coffin of her military aspirations. For weeks after receiving the letter, Elena fell into a routine of aimless wandering. She would wake up each morning, dress carefully as if she had somewhere important to be, and then spend hours walking the streets of her neighborhood, observing the world with the tactical awareness her father had inadvertently taught her. She noticed the gang tags on the walls, the way certain corners attracted trouble, the faces of the dealers and the addicts, and the working families trying to keep their children safe in a place where safety was a luxury few could afford. It was during one of these walks that Elena first heard about the Neighborhood Watch Coalition, a civilian organization that had formed in response to the rising crime rates that the overwhelmed police department seemed unable to address. The coalition wasn't a vigilante group. They were careful to emphasize that to anyone who would listen. Instead, they positioned themselves as the eyes and ears of the community, documenting criminal activity, providing safe escorts for vulnerable residents, and serving as a bridge between the neighborhood and law enforcement. The coalition operated out of a converted warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, a space that had been donated by a local business owner whose own store had been robbed 6 times in 2 years. Elena arrived there on a Thursday evening, drawn by curiosity and a desperate need to find some purpose for the skills and training she had spent years developing. The warehouse was surprisingly well organized, with communication equipment, mapping stations, and even a small armory secured behind reinforced doors. Maria Santos, the coalition's coordinator, was a former Army medic in her 40s who had returned to civilian life after an IED explosion left her with a permanent limp, and a determination to continue serving her community in whatever way she could. She looked Elena up and down with sharp, assessing eyes that missed nothing, not the military straight posture, not the way Alina's gaze automatically cataloged exits and cover positions, not the subtle tension in her shoulders that spoke of someone ready to react to danger at a moment's notice. "You have military training," Maria said. It wasn't a question. "No," Alina replied honestly. "I wanted to serve, but they wouldn't take me, said I wasn't built for combat." Maria's laugh was sharp and knowing. "Their loss. The question is, what are you built for?" That question would prove to be prophetic in ways neither woman could have imagined. Alina threw herself into the coalition's work with the same intensity she had once reserved for her military dreams. She learned the neighborhood's rhythms and patterns, memorized the faces of both the troublemakers and the peacemakers, and developed an almost supernatural ability to be in the right place at the right time to prevent violence before it could escalate. But it was her marksmanship skills that truly set her apart. The coalition maintained a small training facility in the warehouse basement, where members could practice with various firearms under controlled conditions. Alina's abilities quickly became the stuff of legend among the group. She could place 3 shots in a dime-sized group at distances that left seasoned hunters shaking their heads in disbelief. More importantly, she possessed an intuitive understanding of when to shoot, and more crucially, when not to shoot. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Alina had arrived at the coalition as a rejected military applicant looking for something to fill the void in her life. Within 6 months, she had become their most valuable asset, a guardian angel who worked from the shadows to protect a community that the official authorities had largely written off. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same skills the military had deemed unsuitable for combat were now being used to wage a different kind of war. One where the enemy wore civilian clothes and the battlefield was her own neighborhood. As Alina settled into her new role, she began to understand that her rejection from the military might have been a blessing in disguise. In the rigid hierarchy of military service, she would have been just another soldier following orders. Here, in the fluid and dangerous world of community protection, she was free to use her judgment, to adapt her tactics to each unique situation, and to protect people who had nowhere else to turn for help. The official military had looked at Alina Vasquez and seen only what she lacked: the height, the weight, the conventional strength that their manuals said she needed. They had been so focused on their checklists and requirements that they had completely missed what she possessed: a warrior's heart, a protector's instinct, and skills that could mean the difference between life and death for the people who mattered most to her. Little did Alina know that her greatest test was still ahead of her, and that the very rejection that had seemed to end her dreams of service would ultimately lead her to save more lives than any conventional soldier ever could. The military had refused her, but the streets had accepted her, and in that acceptance, she would find both her true calling and her greatest challenge. The first time Alina killed a man, it was to save the life of a 7-year-old girl named Isabella who was walking home from school with a backpack full of books and dreams of becoming a teacher. The shot came from 300 yards away, through a second-story window of an abandoned apartment building, traveling in a perfect arc that would later be analyzed by forensics experts who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing in their reports. It had started as a routine surveillance mission. The coalition had received reports of increased drug activity near Roosevelt Elementary, and Alina had positioned herself in an overwatch position to document the dealers and their customers. What she discovered instead was something far more sinister: a human trafficking operation that was using the school zone as hunting grounds for potential victims. Through her scope, Alina watched as a man in a dark sedan slowly followed Isabella down the sidewalk, matching her pace while speaking urgently into his phone. The girl was completely unaware of the danger, stopping occasionally to pet stray cats or examine interesting flowers growing through cracks in the concrete. Alina's military training had never materialized into actual service, but her father's paranoid lessons about situational awareness had prepared her to recognize predatory behavior when she saw it. The man parked his car and stepped out, approaching Isabella with the practiced casualness of someone who had done this before. Alina could see him speaking to the girl, pointing toward his vehicle with what appeared to be a friendly smile. Isabella, polite and trusting as children often are, began walking toward the car, her small hand already reaching for the door handle. Alina's world narrowed to the space between her eye and the scope. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat steadied, and time seemed to stretch like taffy as she made a calculation that would haunt and define her for the rest of her life. The man was 20 feet from Isabella, close enough that any warning shout would likely cause him to grab her and complete the abduction. A call to police would take precious minutes that the girl didn't have. There was only one solution, and it required Elena to cross a line she had never crossed before. The rifle kicked against her shoulder with familiar authority, and 300 yards away, the trafficker dropped to the pavement like a puppet with severed strings. Isabella screamed and ran, her backpack bouncing against her small frame as she sprinted toward home and safety. Elena remained in position for 40 minutes, watching as police and paramedics arrived, as the area was cordoned off, and as investigators began the process of trying to understand what had happened. That night, Elena sat in Maria's office while the coalition coordinator poured 2 glasses of whiskey and tried to make sense of what they had witnessed through the radio chatter and police reports. The dead man, it turned out, was wanted in connection with the disappearances of 12 children across 3 states. His car contained restraints, sedatives, and a detailed map marking schools and playgrounds throughout the region. Isabella's would-be abduction had been prevented, but at a cost that neither Elena nor Maria had anticipated when they first began their community protection work. "The police think it was a gang shooting," Maria said quietly, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. "Wrong place, wrong time for the trafficker. They're not looking for a sniper." Elena stared at her own untouched whiskey, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline and the weight of what she had done. "I killed someone," she said, the words feeling strange and heavy in her mouth. "You saved someone," Maria corrected. "Isabella Martinez is sleeping safely in her own bed tonight because of what you did. Her parents don't even know how close they came to losing her forever." The weeks that followed brought a strange duality to Elena's life. During the day, she continued her regular coalition activities, conducting surveillance, documenting criminal behavior, and serving as a deterrent presence in the neighborhood's trouble spots. But at night, she found herself haunted by dreams of the shot she had taken, replaying the moment over and over, wondering if there had been another way, another choice she could have made. The answer came a month later, when the coalition intercepted communications suggesting that the trafficking ring was planning to retaliate. They had connected Isabella's near abduction to the coalition's activities, and they intended to send a message by targeting Maria and several other key members. The threat was credible, specific, and immediate. Elena found herself standing once again in an overwatch position, this time on the roof of the warehouse, watching as 3 armed men approached the building under cover of darkness. They moved with military precision, using hand signals and tactical formations that spoke of professional training. These weren't street thugs looking to settle a score. They were operators, brought in specifically to eliminate what the trafficking organization saw as a threat to their business. The first shot came without warning, a muzzle flash from the alley that shattered one of the warehouse windows and sent Maria diving for cover inside. Elena's response was immediate and decisive. 3 shots, 3 targets, fired in rapid succession with the mechanical precision of someone who had moved beyond doubt into absolute certainty of purpose. The silence that followed was broken only by Maria's voice on the radio, shaken, but unharmed, calling for medical assistance for the wounded attackers. Elena had deliberately aimed to incapacitate rather than kill, a choice that would prove crucial in the investigation that followed. 2 of the men survived long enough to provide information that led to the dismantling of the entire trafficking network, saving dozens of potential victims and bringing justice for those who had already been taken. It was during this investigation that Elena received an unexpected visitor. Colonel James Morrison arrived at the coalition warehouse on a rainy Thursday afternoon, wearing civilian clothes, but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of a career military officer. He introduced himself to Maria as a representative of a special Pentagon task force focused on combating human trafficking, and he requested a private meeting with the sniper, whose actions had provided the breakthrough in their months-long investigation. Elena agreed to the meeting, though she insisted it take place on neutral ground. They met at a small cafe in the Arts District, far from both her neighborhood and any military installations, sitting across from each other at a corner table while rain drummed against the windows and steam rose from their coffee cups. "Miss Vasquez," Colonel Morrison began, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase, "I've been studying your file. You applied for military service 18 months ago and were rejected for failing to meet physical requirements." Elena's jaw tightened. "If you're here to rub it in, Colonel, you're wasting both our time." Morrison smiled, an expression that held both respect and something that might have been admiration. On the contrary, I'm here to tell you that rejection was the biggest mistake our recruitment system has made in decades. What you've accomplished with the Neighborhood Watch Coalition has gotten attention at the highest levels of government. You've single-handedly dismantled a criminal organization that our federal task forces had been pursuing for over 2 years. He opened the folder and spread several photographs across the table, surveillance images, crime scene photos, and detailed trajectory analyses of Alina's shots. These are the work of someone with elite-level training and exceptional natural ability. The precision, the decision-making under pressure, the tactical awareness. This isn't the work of a civilian volunteer. This is the work of a warrior. Alina studied the photos, seeing her actions from the cold, analytical perspective of military intelligence. What exactly are you offering, Colonel? A chance to serve your country in a capacity that your unique skills are perfectly suited for, Morrison replied. Not as a conventional soldier, but as something more specialized. Something that recognizes what you can do rather than focusing on what some manual says you can't do. The offer hung in the air between them like a challenge, promising both redemption and an entirely new set of dangers. Alina had found her place with the coalition, had built relationships and established herself as a guardian of her community. But the colonel's words stirred something in her that she thought had been buried forever, the dream of serving something larger than herself, of using her skills to protect not just her neighborhood, but innocent people everywhere who needed someone to stand between them and the darkness. As Alina considered the colonel's proposal, she realized that her journey was far from over. The rejection that had seemed to end her story was actually just the beginning, and the skills that had been deemed unsuitable for conventional warfare were about to be tested on a much larger stage. The question was no longer whether she was good enough to serve. It was whether she was ready for the kind of service that would be asked of her. Alina's decision to accept Colonel Morrison's offer came with a condition that surprised everyone, including herself. She would join his specialized unit, but only if the Neighborhood Watch Coalition could be incorporated as an official community liaison program, with Maria Santos receiving federal funding and recognition for the work they had been doing. It was an unprecedented request that required months of bureaucratic maneuvering, but Morrison's influence and Alina's demonstrated value eventually made it happen. The training facility was located in a remote section of Colorado, hidden among mountains that seemed to touch the sky. Alina arrived on a Monday morning in late fall, carrying a single duffel bag and a letter from her father that she hadn't yet found the courage to open. The base was unlike anything she had imagined, a collection of modern buildings that looked more like a corporate retreat than a military installation, populated by individuals who defied easy categorization. Her fellow trainees were an eclectic mix of rejected applicants, discharged veterans, and civilians with extraordinary skills. There was David Chen, a former video game designer whose understanding of digital warfare had caught the attention of military intelligence. Sarah Acaffer, a former Olympic biathlete who had been blacklisted from competition due to political activism, but whose combination of endurance and marksmanship was unmatched. Marcus Thompson, a discharged Marine whose PTSD had been deemed a liability by traditional military standards, but whose tactical instincts in urban environments were legendary. What united them all was a shared experience of being told they weren't suitable for conventional service, only to discover that their unique perspectives and unconventional skills were exactly what modern warfare required. They were misfits and outcasts, forged into something entirely new under the guidance of instructors who understood that the future of conflict would not be won by traditional soldiers following traditional playbooks. The program, officially designated as the Asymmetric Response Unit, was the brainchild of Morrison and a handful of forward-thinking officers who recognized that contemporary threats required contemporary solutions. Terrorists didn't follow conventional rules of engagement. Human traffickers, drug cartels, and cybercriminals operated in the gray spaces between military and civilian law enforcement jurisdiction. Traditional military units, trained for conventional warfare against uniformed enemies, often found themselves ill-equipped to deal with adversaries who looked like civilians and fought like ghosts. Alina's training focused not just on advanced marksmanship, though her skills in that area continued to evolve beyond what even she had thought possible. She learned urban camouflage techniques that allowed her to become invisible in crowded city environments. She studied behavioral psychology to better identify threats among civilian populations. She mastered advanced communication systems that could coordinate her actions with law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and humanitarian organizations simultaneously. But the most challenging aspect of her training was psychological. Alina had to learn to compartmentalize the weight of life and death decisions, to make split-second choices that could save innocent lives or doom them, all while maintaining the emotional stability necessary to function in civilian society. The military psychologists who worked with the unit understood that traditional methods of dealing with combat stress wouldn't work for operators who had to seamlessly transition between lethal action and normal social interaction. The first real test of Alina's new capabilities came 6 months into her training, when intelligence agencies intercepted communications suggesting that a terrorist cell was planning an attack on a children's hospital in Phoenix. The target was chosen specifically for its psychological impact. The terrorists wanted to demonstrate that nowhere was safe, that even the most innocent and vulnerable members of society could be reached by those willing to embrace absolute evil. Traditional law enforcement was aware of the threat, but lacked the specific intelligence needed to prevent it. Military units could not operate on American soil without raising constitutional concerns. The situation fell perfectly into the jurisdiction of Alina's unit, American citizens, using specialized skills to protect other American citizens from threats that existed in the gray area between crime and warfare. Alina found herself positioned on the roof of an office building 4 blocks from the hospital, part of a coordinated surveillance network that included David monitoring digital communications, Sarah providing mobile overwatch, and Marcus coordinating with local SWAT teams. For 3 days, they maintained their positions, watching and waiting as federal agencies worked to identify the specific members of the terrorist cell. The breakthrough came on the 3rd night when David intercepted an encrypted message indicating that the attack would begin the following morning during shift change, when the hospital would be at its most vulnerable. Alina watched through her scope as 3 individuals approached the hospital's main entrance, moving with the purposeful stride of people who believed they were about to change history. What Alina saw through her scope changed everything she thought she understood about her role and her capabilities. The lead figure approaching the hospital was a woman, approximately Alina's age, wearing scrubs that identified her as a nurse. Behind her, 2 men in maintenance uniforms pushed equipment carts that Alina's trained eye immediately recognized as containing improvised explosive devices. The woman was not just a terrorist. She was a hospital employee who had been radicalized and recruited to provide inside access for the attack. Alina realized with growing horror that this was not a situation where she could simply eliminate the external threats. The woman had legitimate access to the hospital, knew its security procedures, and could detonate devices that would kill dozens of patients, including children in the oncology ward who were too sick to evacuate quickly. Alina's training had prepared her for many scenarios, but not for this one. She could take the shot that would stop the nurse before she entered the building, but doing so would likely trigger the other 2 attackers to detonate their devices immediately. She could wait and try to coordinate with SWAT teams, but the delay might allow all 3 terrorists to enter the building and carry out their plan. In that moment, Alina made a decision that would define the rest of her career and her life. Instead of taking the shot, she spoke into her radio with calm authority. "All units, this is Overwatch. I'm going mobile. Maintain surveillance and be ready to provide support." Alina secured her rifle and began moving, using techniques she had learned both in her formal training and during her time protecting her own neighborhood. She descended from her Overwatch position, crossed 4 blocks of urban terrain without being detected, and positioned herself in the hospital's parking garage with a clear view of all possible entry points. When the nurse and her accomplices arrived at the hospital entrance, Alina was waiting, not with her rifle, but with her sidearm and a plan that required split-second timing and absolute precision. As the nurse reached for her access card to unlock the employee entrance, Alina emerged from behind a parked ambulance. "Maria Gonzalez," Alina called out, using the woman's real name that David had provided through her earpiece. "Step away from the door." The nurse turned, and Alina saw in her eyes the same fanatical certainty that she had seen in the traffickers who had threatened her neighborhood. But she also saw something else: fear, doubt, and perhaps a flicker of the person Maria had been before hatred had consumed her humanity. "You don't understand," Maria said, her voice shaking. "They have my sister. If I don't do this, they'll kill her." Alina kept her weapon trained on Maria while speaking calmly into her radio, coordinating with federal agents who were closing in on the location where the sister was being held. The two male accomplices realized what was happening and began reaching for the detonators connected to their explosive devices. Alina's shots were precise and immediate, 2 rounds that disabled both men without triggering their explosives. But Maria, seeing her companions fall, made a desperate lunge for the hospital door, still determined to complete her mission even as her world collapsed around her. The tackle that brought Maria to the ground was not the work of an elite sniper or a highly trained operator. It was the desperate action of a young woman who understood that sometimes the most important battles are won not with perfect shots from impossible distances, but with simple human contact, one person reaching out to save another from making a choice that would destroy them both. As federal agents secured the scene and explosive ordnance disposal teams safely removed the devices, Alina sat on the concrete next to Maria, both women crying as they waited for ambulances to arrive. Maria's sister was found alive and unharmed in a warehouse across town. The terrorist cell was dismantled. The hospital remained safe. But for Alina, the most significant victory was not the lives she had saved or the attack she had prevented. It was the realization that her greatest strength was not her ability to take life from a distance, but her willingness to risk everything to preserve it up close. The military had rejected her because she didn't fit their template for a soldier. But in that hospital parking garage, she discovered that she was something much more valuable, a guardian who could see the humanity in everyone, even those who had temporarily lost sight of it themselves. Colonel Morrison's evaluation of the Phoenix operation would later become required reading at military academies, studied as an example of how unconventional thinking and adaptive tactics could achieve objectives that traditional approaches could not. But Alina never read the report. She was too busy training for the next mission, the next opportunity to prove that sometimes the best way to save lives is not from behind a scope, but from within the messy, complicated, dangerous proximity of human connection. 2 years after Phoenix, Alina received a mission briefing that would test everything she had learned about herself, her capabilities, and the true meaning of service. Intelligence agencies had identified a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, a network of corrupt officials, defense contractors, and foreign operatives who were systematically undermining American military operations around the world. Soldiers were dying because of compromised intelligence, failed equipment, and betrayed mission parameters. The conspiracy was so deeply embedded in official channels that traditional investigation methods had proven useless. The most shocking revelation was that the network had specifically targeted the asymmetric response unit for elimination. Alina's team had been too successful, had disrupted too many operations, had saved too many lives that were supposed to be lost. Their very existence threatened a shadow economy built on conflict, suffering, and the calculated sacrifice of American service members for profit. The mission briefing took place in a secure facility beneath the Pentagon, in a room that Alina hadn't known existed, until she was escorted there by armed guards who refused to make eye contact. Colonel Morrison was there, along with officials from agencies whose names were classified and whose faces Alina was instructed to forget the moment the meeting ended. On the table between them lay photographs, documents, and recorded communications that painted a picture of betrayal so comprehensive it seemed impossible. "They know about you," Morrison said without preamble. "Your real name, your family, your history with the Neighborhood Watch Coalition. Maria Santos is in protective custody as of 6 hours ago. Your father's house is under surveillance. 3 members of your original coalition team have received death threats." Alina studied the photographs spread across the table, images of people she cared about, people whose lives were now in danger because of the work she had chosen to do. Among them was a picture of Isabella Martinez, now 9 years old and still walking to school with her backpack full of books and dreams, unaware that the woman who had saved her life years ago had made her a target once again. "What do you need me to do?" Alina asked, her voice steady despite the fear and anger churning in her chest. The answer came not from Morrison, but from a woman Alina had never seen before, someone whose presence in the room suggested connections and authority that reached far beyond military command. "We need you to die," she said calmly. Officially, completely, and convincingly. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Elena Vasquez would be killed in a terrorist attack on a humanitarian mission in Syria, her body destroyed beyond recognition, her sacrifice mourning by a grateful nation that would never know the truth of what she had really accomplished. Meanwhile, the person she would become, with a new identity, new history, and new official existence, would be inserted into the conspiracy's inner circle as a freelance operator willing to betray American interests for the right price. The transformation required months of preparation that went far beyond simple identity fabrication. Elena had to learn to think like someone whose loyalty could be purchased, to speak the language of betrayal and self-interest that would make her credible to people who had made careers out of selling their country's secrets. She studied the profiles of actual traitors, learning their motivations and rationalizations, until she could mimic their psychology without losing her own moral center. The hardest part was saying goodbye to the people who had shaped her life without being able to tell them the truth. Elena wrote letters to her father, to Maria Santos, and to each of her coalition teammates, letters that would be delivered only if she didn't survive the mission. In them, she tried to explain that everything she had done, every choice she had made since receiving that first rejection letter from the military, had led to this moment when she could finally serve her country in the way that mattered most. Elena's death was staged during a humanitarian mission to a refugee camp on the Syrian border. According to official records, she had volunteered to provide security for medical personnel delivering supplies to displaced families when their convoy was hit by a roadside bomb. The explosion was real, the casualties were real, and the grief expressed by her supposed teammates was genuine even though they knew she had survived. The woman who emerged from that explosion was someone Elena barely recognized, scarred, hardened, and carrying documentation that identified her as Catherine Reed, a former military contractor with a dishonorable discharge and a willingness to work for anyone who could meet her price. Catherine's cover story was that she had been recruited by the conspiracy during a black market arms deal in Eastern Europe, where her skills had impressed the wrong people for the right reasons. For 6 months, Catherine operated within the conspiracy's network, taking assignments that ranged from sabotaging military supply lines to providing targeting information for attacks on American forces. Each mission required Elena to maintain her cover while secretly ensuring that American casualties were minimized, and that the intelligence she provided was subtly flawed in ways that would expose the conspiracy's operations to loyal intelligence agencies. The psychological toll was enormous. Elena was living a double life within a triple identity, maintaining the facade of a traitor while gathering evidence of actual treason, all while watching American soldiers suffer because she couldn't blow her cover to save them immediately. Sleep became elusive, haunted by the faces of service members who died while she played her role as Catherine Reed, even as she worked to expose the network that was killing them. The breakthrough came during a meeting in a luxury hotel in Geneva, where Elena found herself face-to-face with the conspiracy's true leader, General Patricia Hawthorne, a decorated veteran whose public reputation for honor and service masked a decades-long career of betraying the soldiers under her command. Hawthorne had been selling military secrets since her days as a junior officer, building a network of corruption that had grown to encompass defense contractors, foreign intelligence services, and politicians whose careers depended on maintaining the conflicts that generated their wealth. Catherine, Hawthorne said, pouring expensive whiskey into crystal glasses while discussing the planned assassination of a whistleblower who had gotten too close to the truth. "You remind me of myself when I was younger, disillusioned, angry, ready to take what the world owes me." Elena accepted the glass and forced herself to smile with Catherine Reed's practiced cynicism. "The world owes me a lot, General. I intend to collect." What Hawthorne didn't know was that Elena was wearing a recording device so sophisticated that it could capture conversations through the vibrations of window glass from 3 blocks away. Every word of their discussion, every detail of their plans, was being transmitted in real time to Colonel Morrison and the task force that had been assembled to bring down the conspiracy. The endgame required Elena to make a choice that would have been impossible for the young woman who had once sat in her kitchen reading a military rejection letter. She had to allow herself to be positioned as the shooter in the planned assassination of the whistleblower, a role that would cement her credibility within the conspiracy while providing the opportunity to expose the entire network. The target was Lieutenant Colonel James Porter, a logistics officer whose investigation into missing equipment had uncovered evidence of the conspiracy's activities. Porter was scheduled to testify before a congressional committee in 3 days, testimony that would destroy dozens of careers and expose billions of dollars in illegal arms sales. Hawthorne wanted him eliminated, and she wanted Catherine Reed to pull the trigger. Alina positioned herself in an office building overlooking the restaurant where Porter was scheduled to have lunch with his family, his wife, his teenage daughter, and his elderly father who had flown in from Kansas to support his son's testimony. Through her scope, Alina watched the family's interaction, saw Porter's nervous energy as he checked his phone repeatedly, saw his daughter's innocent laughter as she showed him something on her tablet. At exactly 12:47 p.m., Alina squeezed her trigger. The shot was perfect, precisely calculated, and completely non-lethal. Porter dropped to the ground as the restaurant erupted in chaos, blood spreading from what appeared to be a fatal head wound, but was actually a combination of special effects makeup and theatrical blood that Alina had positioned using a dart fired from her modified rifle. While paramedics rushed to treat Porter's fatal wounds, federal agents were simultaneously raiding locations across 3 continents, arresting conspiracy members based on evidence that Alina had gathered during her months of deep cover work. General Hawthorne was taken into custody in her Pentagon office, still trying to understand how her perfect assassination had gone wrong. The public story was that Lieutenant Colonel Porter had survived an assassination attempt, thanks to quick action by emergency responders, and a shooter whose aim had been thrown off by unexpected wind conditions. The private story was that Alina Vasquez had completed the most complex and dangerous mission in the history of American intelligence operations, dismantling a conspiracy that had cost hundreds of American lives and billions of taxpayer dollars. But the real story, the one that mattered most to Alina, was simpler and more profound. A young woman who had been rejected by the military because she didn't meet their physical requirements had saved more soldiers' lives than any general who had ever commanded troops in battle. She had done it not by following orders or adhering to regulations, but by understanding that true service sometimes requires you to become someone you never wanted to be in order to protect the people you swore to defend. 3 months after the conspiracy was exposed, Alina received a package with no return address. Inside was a medal she had never seen before, one that would never appear in any official records, never be mentioned in any ceremony, never be acknowledged by any government official. Along with the medal was a handwritten note from Colonel Morrison. Some heroes are honored in public. Others are honored in the silence of lives saved and disasters prevented. You will always be the latter, and that makes you the most valuable kind of hero there is. Alina never wore the medal, never displayed it, never told anyone about it. She returned to her neighborhood in East Los Angeles, where Maria Santos and the Neighborhood Watch Coalition welcomed her back without asking questions about where she had been or what she had done. The official records stated that Alina Vasquez had died in Syria, but the woman who walked the streets of her old neighborhood knew that the girl who had once dreamed of military service had finally found the kind of service that her unique skills and uncompromising conscience had always been meant for. Years later, when young people approached Alina asking for advice about military careers or community service, she would tell them that the most important thing was not whether institutions accepted them, but whether they were willing to accept themselves, with all their perceived flaws and unconventional strengths. She would tell them that sometimes the greatest service comes not from following the path that others have laid out for you, but from blazing a trail that no one else could have imagined. And sometimes, when she was walking alone through her neighborhood at night, Alina would remember the weight of a rifle in her hands, the precise calculations that had saved so many lives, and the truth that she had learned through years of rejection and acceptance, failure and triumph. That the greatest warriors are not those who destroy their enemies, but those who find ways to save everyone, even the people who never knew they needed saving.